Today on the Debunking Economics podcast, dog days and hot bonds. Well, there's been a few dog days already this summer, hot, steamy days, which have reached extraordinary temperatures in North America this last week. And government plans to issue bonds to cover the cost of dealing with the climate crisis. It's already happening. Just as they issued bonds for the pandemic emergency, now they want to do the same thing to save the planet. So, is this a good idea? What about Rishi Sunak's idea of issuing retail bonds in the UK for mum and dad investors who want to feel good that they're actually doing something to help save the planet? But will they actually be helping to save the planet? I'm Phil Dobbie, and we'll look at all of that with Professor Steve Keen once again on the Debunking Economics podcast. Welcome along. Well, Canada and the west coast of the United States have been hit with extreme heat this last week. The town of Lytton in British Columbia reached 49.5 degrees centigrade. I've been in Sydney when it's hit that temperature. A heat dome is the cause of it, caused by static high pressure. So this is obviously another example of climate change. NASA said last year, 2020, was the hottest year on record. The record before that was 2019. Then 2016, then 2015, then 2017, 2018 before that. You get the picture? So what do we do about all of this? Because clearly the planet is getting warmer. A start is to focus on public money, perhaps. But where does that money come from? In Europe, the ECB has the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme, which is designed to get people out of the COVID crisis, where the ECB basically buys 1.8 trillion euros of basically government bonds from member countries, which is going to last until March next year. They've still got 700 billion of that left to spend. But it's not all in support of green initiatives. And of course, it shouldn't be when there are countries struggling to get back on their feet. But what about the idea of funding climate action through bond purchases, through quantitative easing, Steve? I mean, you hate QE, so it might be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
It's not really QE, because QE doesn't drop any money in private bank accounts. And this is the reason that, I see all this stuff, particularly on Twitter, of course, with people saying, why did QE not cause massive inflation? It's because it didn't create any bloody money, not directly anyway. And this is, again, where not understanding the accounting involved.
But it enabled governments to overspend, though, didn't it? And that created money. So, maybe governments... No,
not really. No, it didn't. But QE itself was a straight asset swap because QE didn't provide any money to governments. And the bonds that were being purchased... The money that was purchased didn't go anywhere near the government sector. So, I almost see bloody double and triple keeping tables in my head when I think this stuff through. But if you think about the asset side of the banking sector, it's fundamentally reserves, which are the deposits of the central bank. Bonds, which the majority of those are government bonds, treasury bonds that they've purchased, and then loans to the private sector. Those are your three major classifications. Now, what QE was a promise by the Federal Reserve, to take the American case, which is always engaging in what they call open market operations, where they're buying and selling bonds off the private sector. But
they're largely government bonds, aren't they, that they're buying?
They're largely government, but QE extended it because QE said we're going to buy not just government bonds, but also mortgage-backed securities, really, really fantastic high-quality things like that produced by the private banking sector.
Because we never learn.
If you never believe that, I've got a couple of bridges to sell you, and maybe an underpass or two.
Okay, so I feel like we've covered this ground quite a bit, but we have.
But the issue... QE is not money for the government. Yeah.
But the issue about... But it is buying up bonds that governments have issued, by and large, bonds that, whether it's on the secondary markets or primary markets, is buying up bonds that governments have issued. Now, I think maybe if they know that there's a chance that they can keep on, there's absolutely no doubt that central banks and governments have colluded on this over the last year because they've had to. The idea that, hey, don't worry, mate, if you issue a lot more debt, we'll buy it back. Don't you worry about that. So just issue what you think needs to happen. So that's been happening, and that is QE, and that has obviously expanded money because governments have created money that they wouldn't otherwise. They've expanded their budgets further than they would normally, and so that's money creation.
I think I had a fight with an ex-patron recently on this front, with the guy who runs the Canadian Monetary Reform Group. So I'm going to have to continue hammering and say, no, that's not the case, because...
let's take it step by step then. So a government government spends more than it would normally. That is creating more money. Yeah.
That's creating more money, yeah. And that's the point of having a fight with this guy from the Canadian Monetary Reform Group. When you look at the accounting, that's what happens. And the basic rule is that if you want to create money, you have to do something which affects both the asset side and the liability side of the banking sector. If you only affect the asset side or the liability side, you don't create money. And that's lumping, when I say assets and liabilities, I'm also including effectively short-term equity for the banking sector.
Right.
For in the liabilities side of things, is just in terms of working the calculations. But money is fundamentally what's in private bank accounts. Bank accounts people like you and me have at private banks.
Okay, so let's take this quickly because we want to sort this out. It's not really what we came on to talk about, but very quickly, just so we're all in the same space. I'm a government. I overspend my money. I have created money because I've overspent my budget. Then I decide, well, I'm going to cover that by issuing bonds. Mm-hmm. Somebody buys those bonds, and in effect, then the money hasn't, because somebody has bought it. They've bought my debt. Then the act of creating money has disappeared, hasn't it? Because basically I'm now just spending money that somebody else would have spent on something else.
No.
Right. Okay. Explain that to me then. So I'm a billionaire. I've got £1 billion. I'm going to spend it making stuff or buying stuff. And then the government comes along and says, hey, we've overspent this money. You could buy £1 billion worth of our bonds. I go, okay, well, I'll buy that £1 billion of bonds. I'm not spending the money that I would have spent elsewhere. So how is that not sort of like a net zero game in terms of the amount of money in circulation?
This is why this stuff is so important, I think, in double entry bookkeeping terms, is why Minsky matters so much, because it is literally the only program on the planet that lets you look at these things in strict double entry bookkeeping terms. And what you're talking there is the billionaire buys bonds off the government. That's a private non-bank buying bonds off the government or off the private banking sector, for that matter. That actually destroys money, because to buy those bonds, that billionaire is taking $1 billion out of his bank account, purchasing bonds with it in his personal accounts. That means the amount of money he's got in his bank account goes down by $1 billion. The amount of money worth stuff, bonds, goes up by $1 billion. There's no change in his overall net worth. The reason he's done it because he's getting a return on the bonds themselves. The money in the bank account doesn't pay interest these days. The bond does. That's why you do the trade. But in what that means to do it, he's got to reduce the amount of money in his banking account at a private bank, and that reduces the amount of money in circulation. So selling bonds doesn't finance government spending. Right. And this is the point, and that applies.
But if it's reducing money, isn't it reducing money by the same amount that the government created by overspending in the first place?
Yeah, if it does everything. I mean, if it
would be a net zero game, wouldn't it? In that case,
yeah. The fundamental act that creates money is deficit spending, which puts if the deficit, say, we're getting to big numbers these days, £1 trillion. We're getting close to that in the UK economy. £1 trillion of spending increases bank accounts by £1 trillion. It increases the reserves of the private banks by £1 trillion. Now, that's stage one of the operation. That's the part that actually creates money. And when I work in my differential equations, I find that the rate of change, DDT, rate of change with respect to time, of money is deficit, equal to the deficit. And that's not looking at private lending also creating money, but that's what the government does. And that's strictly done by the act of running a deficit. And when the bonds come into it, what you've done by the deficit, if you created $1 trillion worth of money in private bank accounts, you've also created $1 trillion worth of reserves in the bank accounts the private banks have at the central bank. So when you offer that bond for sale to the private banks, you're offering them an asset swap, because they can use the $1 trillion that's been created by the deficit in terms of reserves for them. They can use that to buy the $1 trillion worth of bonds you offer to them.
Right.
And whereas they can't speculate on reserves, there's no market in reserves, because market money is effectively the same as money on the asset side of the books. You can't get a higher and lower price for that. But bonds go up and down in value, so you can actually trade bonds. So reason the banks are...
So it's an asset swap. So as far as
it's an asset swap.
As far as the bank's concerned. And as far as the government's concerned, it's newly created. The overspend is newly created money. So if there's £1 billion that they overspend, that's new money. If the issuing of bonds is a net zero game as far as the bank's concerned, because it's an asset swap. Okay, so it's upshot £1 billion that didn't exist before now exists.
A trillion,
a trillion, billion. What's a billion or a trillion between friends? Exactly.
When we're talking serious money.
When we're talking in a few years, what comes after a trillion? What is it? What's next? What's going to be the when a trillion?
I think we get to quadrillion. I think that's the next one.
That's a big number, isn't it? Now, look, this is a very lengthy discussion about where money is actually created. It does all sort of make more sense the more you listen to this podcast, and we start talking about, do we need to create new money, or do we just need to divert money so that it is allocated to green projects? So to hear all of that, you'll need to listen to the full version of this podcast. To do that, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen and become a supporter there. Either way, you'll be able to listen to this episode in full and obviously all the other episodes that have gone before it. I'm Phil Dobbie, he's Steve Keen. Back next week when we talk about scarcity, that fundamental concept of economics. How could it be just so wrong? That's next week on the Debunking Economics podcast. See you then.